Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another In Conversation With. Today, I am talking to Ellen Chigwanda, who's a senior educationalist around climate change. I'll ask Ellen to introduce herself in a few minutes. I am, as you all know, Dan Sandhu. I'm the CEO at EDT, and our series of In Conversation continues with fascinating insights in education, skills, and development globally. So, welcome to the video blog, Ellen. Over to you. Please, could you introduce yourself so the audience knows who you are and where you operate?
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you to EDT for this opportunity. I'm eternally grateful. I'm Ellen Chigwanda, Senior Technical Advisor at CARE Zimbabwe. I'm based in Harare. I'm actually doubling up as Project Director, the Research Partnership on Education and Climate Change, which is an exciting initiative between CARE Zimbabwe and the Center for Universal Education and the Brookings Institution.
Brilliant. Ellen, firstly, I must say this is the best location for any of the conversations. I've been doing in conversations for over 4 years, and this must be the best location for one of my guests to be in. So, welcome to the video blog.
Thank you so much.
Wow, my pleasure. Just to give everyone context, the last few months I've been really looking at the climate change agenda within education. I was fortunate to go out to the United Nations General Assembly a few weeks ago, and nearly every meeting and every conference and committee meeting I went to there had an element of trying to understand how education can make a substantive and material difference in the climate change agenda and the impact it has on teaching young children around the issues of climate change. From your perspective, Ellen, how has the climate emergency how is it impacting the communities in rural Zimbabwe? And sort of from your again from that lens, what are the main challenges schools are facing in adapting to the impact of climate change, specifically when you have vulnerable groups in society?
Thanks, Dan. I actually feel great talking about this because my relationship with this subject dates back to as far back as 2015, I think, when I was in a kidna scholar with the Brookings institution. And at the time, I was leading a large-scale girls' education project here in Zimbabwe, focusing on 10 rural districts. And one of the challenges that we faced in 2016 was a regional drought, much like we're facing at the moment. And I was very curious about how the drought was affecting some of our monitoring and evaluation data in terms of attendance, in terms of transition, in terms of teacher retention. So it's interesting that, I don't know, 8 years later, this has become topical. At the time, people were looking at me cross-eyed then and wondering what I was talking about. And back to your question, and I'm glad you called it a climate emergency because climate change sounds very fancy. But climate emergency reflects the urgency with which we should be focusing on climate change, particularly in the education sector. And in Zimbabwe, some of the challenges or the ways in which the climate emergency is affecting communities is that, of course, like in any other place in the world, there's increased frequency, intensity, and duration of extreme weather and climate events, droughts, flooding, cyclones, heat waves, and cold spells. And this is, manifesting itself in challenges such as increased food insecurity. You might have seen a recent UN report that is referred to the fact that 5 countries in the Southern Africa region, including Zimbabwe, Malawi, Namibia, and Lesotho, have actually declared states of disaster in relation to the El Nino drought and the resulting hunger. And so there's increased food insecurity at the household and community level. Secondly, droughts undoubtedly cause increased water scarcity. As you know, many of our livelihoods are agro-based. And so when we don't have water, that affects our livelihoods. And resultantly, it also reduces our income. household income to meet, needs such as health, education, food and other needs. And this translates directly to the challenges that the schools are facing. Because if I, as a parent, if you, then as a parent, cannot, if your income is reduced, it's very difficult for you to meet the educational expenses of your children. And therefore, the school's capacity to adapt to climate change are reduced. Increased, climate-related extreme events are also affecting school infrastructure, classrooms, teacher housing, latrines, which affect attendance, which affect the learning environment that the children find themselves in. And then also, finally, I wanted to say that schools are finding themselves in a situation where there's increasing demand for feeding because of the food insecurity situation, where children are, failing to concentrate and to get the full experience of the classroom because of hunger, which also affects cognitive development and ultimately learning outcomes.
That's, I mean, fascinating, and I think people may not appreciate that those, some of them are quite infrastructure impacts, and the impact that has on education. We at EDT have done a lot of research and working with partners like UNICEF on and Save the Children about educational impacts. And there's great, we've got great examples how communities prepare for all eventualities in the disaster situation, but not the school. So they'll prepare for locating populations, looking at road infrastructure, other infrastructures, but they won't look at the infrastructure around the school and what the impact could be. And in terms of from the educational perspective, what role do you think education could play in terms of mitigating the effects of this emergency, and how would that differ by gender?
And so, just picking up from where you left, and when you look at education, when you just think of a community in rural Zimbabwe, rural Malawi, rural Kenya, the school is the center of that community. If you want to mobilize, the school is where parents meet. If food is being distributed, the school is the center. And so the school should become a non-negotiable part of a climate response in any community because of the centrality of, of interventions that come together within that particular community. And, as you mentioned, when you look at education in emergencies, the priorities around shelter, around, water and sanitation, food distribution, all of which are very important. But I think we also forget about the comfort that the school, or psychological safety that the school provides in a climate emergency. That should be prioritized at the same level as all of the other interventions that are, implemented within a climate emergency. But also, I think thinking about education as an important space for the next generation of leaders to understand the role that they have in order to contribute to a more sustainable future. And so how can learners learn about climate change, not for academic purposes then, for passing the exam, but rather to help them to become green citizens, for them to become climate champions, for them to develop and acquire green skills that help them to perhaps shape a future that is different from what us as adults have shaped so far. And so education for me should become front and center of any climate response in a community, in a country, because of the promise and the energy that young people bring in building a sustainable future. When you think about the work around education and climate change, you're essentially bringing in three very important SDGs: SDG 4, SDG 5, which is gender, SDG 13, which is looking at climate action. And it's important that you talk about the gender component because whilst we know that climate change affects everyone, we do know that it does have a disproportionate impact on women and girls. And so when you look at female adolescent learners, they, together with their male counterparts, their voices should be heard just as much, and they should be capacitated, and they already have the experience based on the household patterns of, household chores, and how they already understand how to save water, why water is important. How can we translate that into indigenous knowledge into leadership practice that helps them to lead climate responses that are locally led and contextually relevant and youth led so that we have a sustainable future?
I love the point you make about it being non-negotiable, and I think that attitude is changing. I think that attitude is changing as we have globally, particularly in the more affected regions, younger politicians who have grown up with emergency being the terminology rather than change. And I think that that's making a tangible difference. In terms of when considering the curricula required and the curricular changes required about climate, um, what are the considerations needed with respect to gender?
So when you look at the curriculum, I've been doing some research, Dan, in one of the rural regions in Zimbabwe. And one of the questions I would ask adolescent learners is, what's your favorite subject? And some of them will talk about English. They'll talk about math. The boys will talk about mathematics. I wanted to understand what their ambitions are and what drives them. And so, in understanding that, I also spoke to the teachers, and I wanted to understand which of these subjects have climate concepts incorporated into the existing curricula. And you'll find that it's subjects such as geography, agriculture, environmental science. And in fact, the maths teachers didn't even want to talk to me because they said climate change has nothing to do with mathematics. Climate change has nothing to do with languages. But when you look at young people, they are more invested in things that they like, peer networks, and subjects that they enjoy. So I wonder what would happen if you think about curriculum development from a perspective of incorporating relevant, contextually relevant climate concepts across all subjects and find ways of incorporating climate change in activities that students themselves enjoy. And the gender piece comes in the sense that, boys and girls naturally will tend towards certain subjects. And so if we, engage with young people, both collectively and separately, and understand what drives them, what subjects are they interested in, that can help us to think about, more innovative approaches of delivering climate education. The research partnership I talked about with Brookings is actually focusing on exactly that, focusing on exploring what are some of the innovative approaches that teachers are using to deliver climate education beyond the traditional academic subjects. And what are the ways that young people are interested in is it technology? Is it project based? Is it play based? That can help them to acquire the knowledge and the skills that they need in order to be part of this climate conversation.
It's really fascinating. I was involved many years in a teacher training organization, and we used to have a case study about a teacher in Morocco that would teach their children using what was available. So, olive grove, olive trees. And I think that was bringing that concept of teaching outside about everything. And yes, it covered mathematics, it covered geography, it covered history, but most importantly, it reminded the students and the children about the value of the ecosystem, which has a direct correlation to understanding about climate. And I suppose in terms of impacting communities, and we've done research at EDT that shows that the gender plays a real interesting role in the agency that communities have and who the communities listen to. Uh, What work do you think we need to do in gender, from a gender perspective, which goes hand in hand to supporting those communities to take action?
It's encouraging to note, and as CARE, we place women and girls at the center of everything we do. Gender equality is actually, or gender justice is actually one of our 6 impact areas globally. And, we're seeing encouraging developments with, vis-a-vis, social norms change and really communities coming together to challenge some of those, traditional practices that, um, discriminate against women and girls. But I think what's important with the climate conversation is to explore ways in which we can elevate the voices of, different people, women and girls, boys and men, young versus old. How do we make sure that every segment of the community, their voices are being heard? Because everyone does bring an experience to the table. For example, I wanted to share with you that as part of this research I've been doing, I've actually found that young people are now associating climate change with mental health, especially girls, because they talk about how when a river is flooded, they're so afraid of going to school. They talk about how when their parents have to migrate to neighboring South Africa because of reduced income, they're afraid of being, part of a child-headed household. So how do we bring the voices of, everyone to the table to ensure that we're elevating all the different voices? And then you will know this, there's a whole drive towards localization, locally led initiatives. And that can only happen if we tap into indigenous knowledge systems, which value women and girls' experiences, and which doesn't only look at quantitative data as the gold standard, but looks at women and girls' experiences, men and boys' experiences as data, and use that to inform decisions and locally led initiatives and make sure that we are elevating the voices and by challenging the whole notion that women and girls should not be part of, leadership and decision making at the community level.
I think that's fascinating. We spent at EDT spent many years working Kenya around girls' education. I was very insightful to understand the impact one can have with in understanding the impact that has not on the girls' education, but the societal impact of understanding about an educated young female population. We also obviously we're working in Zimbabwe at the moment, and I think the same thing about making sure from a teacher development we're trying to incorporate this piece in. I mean, really would be interesting to hear what you feel some in your kind of in your experiences where there are some promising, encouraging practices in your work, Ellen, in empowering adolescent girls in specific contexts of Zimbabwe.
hmm So I'll share one promising practice, and this is a pilot that we developed and has been implemented in Chiwi district, which is a climate affected, drought prone region in southwest Zimbabwe. And this is the building climate resilience pulse pilot. And what we've done with this pilot is that, water, I've seen studies that have talked about water being a predictor for attendance, as far as school is concerned. And in fact, a recent ActionAid report has talked about how drought has been increasing even, forced marriages among, teenagers in Southern Africa because of the drought as families marry off girls in exchange for food. And so this building climate resilience schools project is really bringing together learners, the school authorities, the communities. And what we did was to convert a manually pumped water site into a solar powered water facility that has a 30,000 liter storage tank capacity so that the school is able to have all year round access to water. And what this has enabled the school to do is to, make sure that they have a nutritional garden, they are doing fish farming, and all of that is supporting their school feeding. The facility itself is also facilitating learning for the learners, and adolescent girls were part and parcel of the design itself. And we're also finding that conflict resolution has also been achieved because the project has been able to provide water for the community outside of the school and water for students and the learners and the teachers within the school. And that has enabled us to make sure that learning is ongoing, water is available, girls can meet their menstrual management hygiene needs, and teacher retention is at its highest at the school because teachers are essentially saying, if there's water here, I'm not going to transfer it to another school. So this is really encouraging, and we are tracking that project, the pilot, with a view to scaling it to other areas. And I know other organizations are doing similar and even better innovations as well.
I mean, that's a fascinating insight, an absolutely great example how, again, in that specific example, the school becomes the hub of the community, not just for the students or the children or the girls, but the whole community. And it plays a pivotal role. And I think those initiatives remind people not only just of the importance of the school, but of where it sits in the community and gets you support of the community because these can be quite disruptive and concerning and scary innovations in areas where sometimes innovation doesn't naturally filter through to impacting the local community. So that's been fascinating. Ellen, it's been really interesting talking to you. I found it very inspirational, very eloquent the way you explained non-negotiable natures of how the schools fit into the community, how we've talked about the passion and energy of the youth in driving some of these changes. And I think that energy obviously is coming through from you as well. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. And again, thank you for the backdrop of Harare in Zimbabwe for this conversation. Thank you very much, Ellen.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for the opportunity.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for listening in. I look forward to joining you again in the future in conversation with. Thank you very much.